Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So continuing from Buddhadhamma, Payutto Chapter 11, Happiness, page 911. This section is called, Despite the Glut of Consumable Objects, Happiness is on the Wane. Yeah, I've been reading this. This is all extremely good stuff. I hope it's not a bit too repetitive for people, but I guess repetition isn't so bad. One of the consequences of the inability to know what is enough and the constant pursuit of happiness is that people develop the characteristic of being prone to suffering and find it increasingly difficult to be happy. Compare this with children. Most children, from the early days before they could walk, laugh openly, smile with delight, and are easily amused. Little things that they obtain or see give them happiness. But as people grow up, they find it more and more difficult to find happiness. As mentioned above, those things that at one time provided happiness are now considered boring, leading to indifference and a lack of enthusiasm. In order to be happy, things must accord with a long list of desires and preconditions. And yet these people still don't experience real gratification. They chase after things without ever reaching their destination. It becomes more and more difficult to satisfy them. When it becomes increasingly difficult for people to be happy, they also become more easily agitated. Before, going without certain things, living with certain inconveniences, and being required to perform certain tasks was not a problem. These situations didn't cause suffering. Later on, they may become well off, own an abundance of things, and be extremely comfortable. They can order others to do their own work. The only muscle in the body that gets exercised is the index finger. But they may become attached to this ease and convenience. If they lack anything, if something doesn't arrive exactly on time, if they don't get what they want, or they must do something requiring effort, all of these situations become a source of suffering. They thus become more prone to suffering, and they accumulate suffering. This runs counter to true spiritual development. If one is engaged in proper spiritual development, as one gets older, one should be more proficient at being happy. One should be able to increasingly generate internal happiness, and one should find it easier to be happy and be less prone to suffering. Those who are developing spiritually must be simultaneously developing in happiness. Their happiness must be increasing. Within the ordinary sphere of human living situations or responsibilities, they should feel confident about experiencing happiness. They can make the claim to others, "Don't waste your time trying to make me unhappy. You won't succeed." These days, however, the reverse seems to be occurring. People seem to find it increasingly difficult to discover happiness, and they are unnaturally more prone to suffering. Many children in the IT age seem to have this trait. One cause for this is that the upsurge in technological advances permits a quick gratification of desire in regard to consuming material things, and it increases material comfort. The drawback is that people become more easily jaded, or else they feel they cannot live without these comforts. In order to feel satisfied, they must acquire things as quickly as they desire them. The real reason, however, is an inadequate and incorrect spiritual practice. The result is that, instead of technological growth helping to promote true happiness, it ends up crippling people's ability to experience happiness. people then become incapable of experiencing true happiness. This is what happens when people deal with technology incorrectly. They fail to derive the true benefit from it. Instead of receiving its positive effects, they receive its negative ones. The greater the abundance of material things, and the greater the ease and convenience in society, the more important it becomes for people to train their minds and develop the ability to find happiness. If people simply get caught up in pursuing pleasure from external objects, they will find it increasingly difficult to be happy. At the same time, they will neglect the training in an increased capability to experience happiness. Besides squandering an opportunity to develop themselves, they may eventually be incapable of any form of happiness. For this reason, give heed to developing one's capability to experience happiness. Otherwise, there will be no end to problems. People's own search for happiness will be futile, and the internal suffering will intensify. Mutual oppression in society will increase, and the world will become a more troubled place. There will be no hope for peace. If one develops happiness correctly, however, all internal dilemmas will be resolved. Various spiritual factors will be activated and set into place, because in a correct spiritual practice, the vital spiritual factors are naturally linked and integrated. Sense desire, the desire for material objects, is thus fraught with danger, and it is the cause for various kinds of wrongdoing. People desire sense pleasure within a, quote, system of preconditions. Parentheses, see the earlier material on this subject, which is linked to the material here. The result is that the extent and range of immoral conduct is amplified. This is how craving operates within a system of preconditions, in which people seek desirable objects by avoiding or by half-heartedly conforming to the direct processes of nature. Our responsibility is thus to help people to develop wholesome desire and to integrate human laws with natural laws. This gives an outline of the advantages and disadvantages of happiness. The essential point is that one applies, quote, liberating wisdom, nisarana panya, in regard to all forms of happiness, beginning with sense pleasure until one reaches the freedom from mental defilement. While experiencing happiness, be vigilant and know moderation. This way, one will become or will remain strong and avoid mental weakness. Next section, number 10, practical application. Section A, summon wisdom to deal with suffering. In the development of happiness, it is important not to neglect the term dukkha, suffering. An acknowledgement is made that suffering exists, and that it is both placed in opposition to and paired alongside happiness. People need to gain a comprehensive and clear perspective of these matters, rather than practice avoidance and leave unresolved issues to fester in the mind. Moreover, if one is happy, yet suffering still exists, then that happiness is not true and reliable. Therefore, the development of happiness implies the simultaneous reduction, removal, disappearance, and cessation of suffering. The expression, development of happiness, can thus be replaced with the expression, cessation of suffering. These refer to one and the same process. And for this process to be complete, regardless of how much happiness a person may experience, one must reach the stage of the utter cessation of suffering. Technically speaking, to counter the sense that the development of happiness is open-ended and without a clear end goal, it is referred to as the cessation of suffering. The term cessation, which is a translation for the Pali term nirodha, carries with it specific linguistic problems in that its meaning is not altogether clear and it may give rise to misunderstanding. When people hear the phrase cessation of suffering, they may understand that this refers to a gradual yet constant elimination or removal of suffering existing in the heart. In fact, the true meaning of nirodha refers to the non-arising of suffering, or to the complete and utter freedom from suffering. On the highest level, Nirodha refers to Nibbana, a state completely free from suffering. Occasionally, the term Anupada Nirodha is used, translated as cessation by means of non-arising, that is, absolute or complete cessation. For the sake of convenience, we may thus translate Dukkha Nirodha as the non-arising of suffering, or freedom from suffering. Partly for ease of mind of the listeners, when this subject is discussed, the term suffering is often avoided, and instead the process is described as the development of happiness. Note, however, that by doing so, one is not neglecting the subject of suffering, and eventually one will need to address it accordingly. The expression development of happiness necessarily implies the proper management of suffering. An essential aspect of suffering is one's attitude and relationship to it. If one fails to understand the importance of this point, then one will be unable to truly develop in happiness. Here we are referring to the duty or responsibility, Pali Kicca, vis-a-vis suffering. If one gets this wrong, then one's entire spiritual practice will be misdirected and end in failure. People often neglect this essential factor. As suffering is the first noble truth, let us review the duties or responsibilities pertaining to all four of the noble truths. Suffering, dukkha, a state of pressure and affliction, acting as a basis for human problems. Alternatively, anything that has the capacity to create problems. The associated responsibility here is pariññā, thorough or comprehensive understanding. 2. Cause of suffering, samudaya. The associated responsibility is pahana, abandoning, eliminating, or ending. 3. Cessation of suffering, nirodha. The associated responsibility is sachikiriya, realizing, seeing clearly, actualizing, or attaining. 4. Path, magga, the way leading to the end of suffering. The associated responsibility is bhavana, cultivating, developing, practicing, or undertaking. Without going into a lengthy analysis of these four responsibilities here, note, however, that they are of fundamental importance. They exist inextricably paired with the Four Noble Truths. For if one practices any of the Four Noble Truths incorrectly in respect to its associated duty or responsibility, one's progress in the Dhamma will come to naught and one's efforts will be in vain. It will be impossible to awaken or to realize the Dhamma. In respect to the first noble truth, the Pali states, quote, with suffering there should be thorough understanding, dukkhang pariññayang. Suffering must be understood by way of wisdom. Suffering is there to be understood. A simple example of this is that before one is able to solve a problem, one must first understand the nature of the problem. The definition of dukkha is not limited to the general concept of physical and mental pain and discomfort. The term also refers to everything that has the potential to create a sense of oppression when one fails to respond to it correctly. For this reason, the subject of suffering requires comprehensive understanding. In sum, suffering is a matter to be taken up and dealt with by wisdom. It is not something to be stored up and accumulated in the heart until it oozes out or goes rancid and one loses one's radiance and joy. If one encounters suffering, welcome it with wisdom. Don't allow the mind to get caught up with it, or as people informally say, don't obsess over your emotions. Don't burden or oppress the mind with suffering. And if the mind has already allowed it entry, don't let it smolder. Hasten to send it on to wisdom. If one simply stores up suffering within the heart, one suffers in vain. One does not dispel it, and one's life becomes stuck. Yet, if one allows wisdom to deal with it, besides finding solutions to end it, one's whole life moves forward. It is not the mind's responsibility to deal with suffering. This responsibility rests with wisdom. The mind's task is not to bear suffering, but rather to apply wisdom. The principal agent in this matter is wisdom, which solves problems and dispels suffering. Wisdom brings suffering to an end, and at the same time generates happiness. The mind's responsibility is to witness happiness. One should develop the mind's proficiency for experiencing happiness and develop wisdom's ability to solve problems and dispel suffering. A healthy mind is endowed with happiness, and healthy wisdom is capable of dispelling suffering. For the mind to be truly healthy and happy, wisdom must completely dispel suffering. Spiritual practice needs to be accurate by attending to the duty corresponding to each of the Four Noble Truths. If one oppresses oneself by accumulating suffering, causing internal distress, frustration, and depression, one is responding to suffering incorrectly. Instead, one needs to change course and summon wisdom to help. Happiness is classified as part of the Third Noble Truth, cessation, nirodha. It is recognized that there are relative degrees of happiness which need to be developed until one reaches supreme happiness. The responsibility here is saccakiriya, to realize, actualize, or perfect happiness. This development of happiness should be attended to as a regular and constant part of one's life. The ability to be happy is the starting point of spiritual practice. For this reason, one needs to establish oneself correctly from the outset, so that one goes in the right direction and proceeds with confidence. I think I'll stop a little bit early at that because the next section is quite long. Yeah, just the one comment that I have is I just appreciated just the sort of distinction between the responsibility of the mind, and when he pointed out just in this last bit here, it is not the mind's responsibility to deal with suffering. This responsibility rests with wisdom. The mind's responsibility is to witness happiness. And I kind of like that distinction because it takes kind of sort of the personal nature out of the reference to the word mind, or citta, I assume is what he's using here, and kind of assigns the task of dealing with suffering to the active engagement with wisdom, the discernment, being able to see cause and effect, and the nature of how dukkha arises and passes away, and its impersonality. So it kind of assigns the responsibility to actively getting to know suffering to this faculty of wisdom. And then the mind's responsibility is to know, to witness, and particularly to know and witness the cessation of suffering, or the happiness that comes as a result. So it kind of was a nice reminder of these are all skills that can be developed that aren't personal, and if we don't have them, we don't have to take that personally either. We just use it as a reminder to that this is all a matter of developing skills and different mind habits.
It makes sense that happiness should grow as the spiritual path is developed, and that wisdom allows that, and wisdom lets go and all that. But I just had I live out in the world, and the world this country has gotten very weird in the last few years, and I don't have the wisdom and the skills really to deal with it. It's just made me so confused and sad and angry. And I know in the big picture, it comes and goes, and I know, internationally, maybe we're kind of spoiled. We've had this system that's worked, but I try to disengage and I try to let go, and I just have to face that it's been very, very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, I feel like I'm completely failing spiritually because I'm unable to deal with it sometimes. Mm-hmm. And I fear that it's going to continue and what will happen, and I can't force wisdom, and it's been really difficult. I just wanted to bring that up, talking about happiness, really thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think one is just to be able to acknowledge, and because that's we can't really ever begin to if we keep stuffing it down or keep lashing out or keep distracting ourselves in various ways, then that is not, that's an inappropriate response. So then the willingness to look at it straight on and be cultivating wisdom. It's like the Lumpur Liam's, I think I mentioned it a little while ago, is asked what his biggest difficulty was, and he responded. This was by the question was asked by the abbot of current abbot of the city of 10,000 Buddhas, and Lumpur responded by saying, "Well, probably fear was the most difficult to deal with, but you can't really look at it that way. And a better way to look at it is that say difficult states of mind, difficult circumstances are like a worthy opponent that we are able to cultivate our skill with, and so it's because oftentimes we get the feeling of being overwhelmed, and but then to look at it in terms of that's a challenge that I can rise up to rather than be overwhelmed by, and the opportunity for understanding is always there. Opportunity for wisdom is always there. So therefore, the opportunity for happiness and well-being is there. And also, I think one of the things is the point that Ajahn Ñāṇiko emphasized that Payutto was making is that that distinction of because the function of mind is to know, to experience, and wisdom is kind of a factor of mind, or it's a kind of a subset, in the sense that, like in one of the things that really was a catalyst for Ajahn Chah's practice and growth in his practice was Ajahn Mun's advice and encouragement for him to reflect in terms of practice of to see the difference between the mind and the moods of the mind, so that the mind is the capacity to know the moods of the mind are what are constantly coming and going, the unhappiness, the frustration, and even happiness, or however we interpret it. Because what we tend to do is we identify with the mind as mine and me. This is me, this is mine, this is what I am. That's the classic definition of self. And we do that with mind, and forget to look at the aspect of it being, oh, these are moods that do come and go, and so that can be a really important, essential, because I think that there is there's a very human propensity, but it's also a very, very cultural propensity to, identify with mind as me. This is the sum total of me is my mind, and then it conflates moods and impressions and states of mind, moods of the mind. So then that being able to separate that out is the function of wisdom and discernment.
To be the knower.
Yeah,
and to kind of to dovetail on that you were saying, I don't feel like I have wisdom, or, it's hard, the wisdom doesn't work. But that actual process of turning towards the feeling of the dukkha, the feeling of frustration, that is wisdom.
That actually is wisdom, in the sense of, because it's just so easy to objectify thing, especially when it's some difficulty, or or objectify in terms of, it's out there, it's just so awful, or objectify some kind of distraction that I can absorb into, so that it's. But you obviously don't find that viable, and that in itself is wisdom.
Yeah, turning towards the actual experience without getting lost in the narrative, which is not always so easy to do.
I really appreciated the third noble truth as cultivation of happiness. I had never thought of the end of suffering as the cultivation of happiness. That was a really valuable way of putting that. I think it seems to me that you get to a point of going, it's impossible for me to be happy, and then you get really happy. But I also think, I think to myself, sometimes, may I be happy? And I go, do I really want to be happy? I don't think I do. I think I cling to injustice and to suffering, and without that aspect of wisdom to see where the clinging to especially injustice, is happening, then you're saying, may I be happy, but you don't really mean it. That's just speaking for myself.
No. Many of us delight in a good grumble,
May I be happy?
There's a fair amount of temporary gratification that comes with a good grumble. That was the other thing, actually, I was noticing that I appreciated too. Just kind of, sometimes the third noble truth, like the third noble truth, the cessation of suffering. There is an end to the cessation of suffering, and it sounds so, and it is, so absolute, and the final nibbana. It's nibbana, the third noble truth. And so it's sometimes I kind of, in a way, I think kind of dismiss it as like, oh, okay, well, that's a long way away. The third noble truth is a long way away. But if you consider it as like a gradual progression of, letting go of bits and pieces of that which causes the suffering, And that's, that is part of cessation. That's part of the Third Noble Truth and the development of all the different kinds of happiness that lead to the ultimate happiness. That's all also partial realization of the Third Noble Truth. So it kind of, makes it more accessible. The Third Noble Truth is actually here and now too. That's something that I kind of got from this.